Within the next week, we as a church are going to begin a series exploring the book of Revelation. It's going to be a short series, intentionally so, but I think it will be significant in shaping how many of us approach and read this book of the Bible. But there is something that gets in the way. There is a barrier between us and doing this series on Revelation. And that barrier is the immense amount of baggage that this book of the Bible has managed to accumulate over time. See, in 2008, I was interning at a large Auckland church in their senior ministers department. And during my time serving in that department, I was tasked with the responsibility of organizing the senior pastor's library. Now, the library was full of all those books that you would expect to find, except for one. And that was a little book that was called 88 Reasons Why the Rapture Will Be in 1988. Now, just 3 years after finding that book in my senior pastor's library, billboards began appearing around Auckland. They were part of the American radio preacher Harold Camping's campaign, in which he believed that the end of the world was going to occur on the 21st of May, 2011. That was his fifth such prediction, which was closely followed by a sixth, which has also since come and gone. And then 3 years after those billboards began appearing, John Hagee published a book that predicted that the end of the world would be in 2015, as he believed that a series of 4 lunar eclipses across mid-2014 and late 2015 would mark the end of the world as recorded in the book of Revelation. These failed predictions of the end of the world, they almost universally use the spectacular images and numeric symbols in the book of Revelation. And Revelation has been used this way with such frequency that a Wikipedia page is dedicated to failed predictions such as these. Predictions that are so numerous that they had to be further categorized by the century in which those predictions were made. In considering its history of failed prediction, Timothy Webber wrote in the book, A Historic Case for Premillennialism, that sometimes all that was needed to keep the rank and file happy was a good second edition. They have proven themselves to be quite willing to forgive and forget their teachers' mistakes, and they seem eager to accept new explanations. And so, at some point, we need to ask the question, does this seem right to you? Does this seem right? Are you satisfied with a system of belief that comes with such a rich history of failed predictions and readings that require constant revisions? Are you confident that you and those voices you listen to are reading this book correctly? So with more baggage than an Easter camp trailer, let's begin clearing the table so that we can explore the book of Revelation afresh, setting aside as best we can our assumptions of it and our history with it so that we can approach it with as clean a slate as possible. And that will allow us to start at the very beginning with the genre of the book of Revelation, which will then provide us with that stable foundation we can begin to build from. Now, in the same way that we might blend together different genres by including a poetic phrase or the line from a hymn in our letter or message to someone, John does exactly the same thing in the book of Revelation. Here in this book, he blends together 3 different genres, and these genres are letter, prophecy, and apocalypse. Now, what's important here is that word blend, because these 3 genres are blended together in such a way that they can no longer be cleanly separated from each other. And we see this in the very first chapter, where in verse 1, John begins with exactly the same kind of introduction we would find in any other letter. only for him to then say in verse 3 that what he's writing is in fact prophecy, before he then shares an apocalyptic image of Christ among the lampstands in verse 9, which then extends into the letters to the 7 churches. See, recognizing the blend of genres is really important, because often we can assume that the book of Revelation is a book of 2 distinct parts. There is the letters from chapters 1 through 3, and then there's the apocalypse from chapter 4 onwards. But when we artificially separate the book this way, we end up approaching each section with radically different interpretive assumptions. But the book isn't a book of 2 parts. It's one continuous whole, constructed, as we see right there in chapter 1, through the blending of 3 different genres. What this means is that the rules of interpretation that we apply need to be consistent throughout the entire book of Revelation. And at all times, we need to be mindful of the genres that John has blended together and how those genres need to be read. So what are those rules? How should we approach letters, prophecies, and apocalypses? You know what? I'm really glad you asked. Letters are occasional documents. They are documents that arise from and are intended to speak into a specific occasion. We see this in the wonderful little letter of Philemon in the New Testament. There, Paul wrote this letter to a specific person, in this case, Philemon. And it was written to address a specific issue, in this case, the return of his slave Onesimus, all of which arose from first century Greco-Roman society. What this means is that the content of letters, both written and received, must have been understood by those who wrote and received them. And so the way in which we, as those living in 21st century New Zealand, the way we enter into the understanding of the letter is by first entering their world to receive their document as they would have. And the outcome of this is that whatever interpretation we might apply to a letter, it's only legitimate if those who received the letter could have come to that conclusion as well. That's just how letters work, both then and now. It's the basic assumption that we apply to any biblical letters, including those like Philemon, because letters are occasional documents written by a particular person for a particular reason to be understood by a particular audience. But what about prophecy then? What about the second genre of the book of Revelation? What rules should we follow when reading prophetic literature? Well, a good place to start might be considering the time in which prophetic literature arose and the associated role that prophets played in Israel, because after all, they are the ones who write and define this genre. While biblical prophecy has its origins in Moses, it's mostly concentrated in the late Old Testament and the New Testament. In fact, the bulk of biblical prophecy can be further concentrated again, finding most of it produced in a 300-year period prior to 500 BC, followed by another 100-year period during and immediately after Christ. And so why does this long tradition of biblical prophecy become so densely concentrated into just 2 sets of time, totaling 400 years? The reason is found in the needs of God's people during that time. In each of those blocks of time, there were significant upheavals in the lives of the people of God. Upheavals that affected every sphere of their life: political, military, economic, social, and religious, as Israel began compromising and turning towards foreign gods. So what the people of God needed was to hear God's message afresh. They needed to hear God call them back to faithful worship, and that is where the prophet stepped in. See, the role of a prophet wasn't that of a fortune teller. In fact, it was probably a little bit more like that of a lawyer. Academics will describe them as covenant enforcers, as they were tasked with calling their people back to faithful worship as defined in God's covenant with them. That means that the prophets' focus was very much on the present, not the future, because their whole ministry was about calling people back to faithfulness in the here and the now. The result of this is that to the extent to which they spoke of the future is usually limited to the future consequences of present unfaithfulness. Here we might see a parallel in how a parent might warn their child that they would lose screen time if they keep stealing the cooking chocolate. I can't have been the only child who did that. In the same way, we wouldn't describe the threat of potential discipline as a prediction of the future. The same is true of almost all future-orientated statements found in biblical prophecy. One example of this might be Jonah. Jonah prophesied a future judgment which never occurred. Why? Because the future judgment was conditional on the people's response in the present. And this was true even while there was no suggestion of conditionality in his prophecy itself. But here's the thing. He didn't have to say that the prophecy was conditional, because the people understood that that's just how prophecy works. Its future statements are rarely about foretelling the future, but usually about changing behavior in the present, just like a parent's threat of future discipline. Now, of course, there are a few exceptions, but they are comparatively rare. For instance, only 2% of the Old Testament prophecy looks forward to Jesus, and only 1% references events that are yet to occur. So yes, prophets and their writings did on the rare occasion include predictions of the future that aren't conditional on the present. But that's clearly the exception, and it isn't the norm. And that is why Jezebel is able to be called a false prophet. Not because she made false predictions about the future, but because she drew people away from faithful worship to Yahweh in the present. It is the present and the present faithfulness of God's people that is the overwhelming concern of a biblical prophet. And so it's the metric by which prophets are determined to be either false or true. As a genre, apocalypses are a little more difficult to interpret than letters or prophecy. And that's because a primitive form of the genre seems to have begun around the time of Daniel, from which it progressively developed formal structures and then finally ceased being written around the time of the 2nd century. So with no new apocalypses having been written for about 1700 years, it's just not a genre we're very familiar with. But we've already taken the first steps to understanding apocalyptic literature by noting the time in which they were written. From the time of Daniel through to the time of the New Testament, the people of God experienced constant oppression from foreign powers. And we've already talked about that. Be that Babylonian, Persian, Greek, or Roman. It's during these times, as an oppressed people facing an ungodly and powerful oppressor, that the people of God wrote apocalypses. This is why apocalyptic texts are unique in that they don't anticipate a transformation of the present, but rather the end of history itself. Because it's in that end that they find an anticipated judgment, and in that judgment, they find hope. They find hope that their innocence will be recognized in that judgment, and a hope that their oppressor's evil will be finally dealt with. Apocalypses then take that forward-looking hope and use that future judgment as a lens through which to view the present. And this is where the genre apocalypse gets its name, meaning revelation. They are designed to reveal to their readers the realities of the present through the lens of a future judgment. And the intent of this is to encourage the faithful to hold fast to their faith and to urge those who are compromising or assimilating with foreign powers and foreign religions, encouraging them to return to faithfulness. And all of this is achieved by using rich metaphors and symbolism and imagery that leaves no room for grey. See, regardless of the reality to which the harlot drunk on the blood of the martyrs may point, the horrific image alone is enough to turn the reader to flee from whatever that may be and return to worship of the Lamb seated on the throne, surrounded by light and angels and elders. But I did just make a mistake there. And I wonder if you caught it. I made a mistake because I referred to those receiving the message of Revelation as readers. But they weren't readers, were they? They were hearers. Because literacy levels at the time that this book was written was so low that there simply wasn't a culture of private or personal reading. That just didn't exist. What the culture was around text was one of public recitals of written texts. And Revelation is no different. It was written to be read in one setting to the churches in Asia Minor. And that becomes really important as it guides how we should approach that rich stylistic imagery we find in Revelation. We should approach it as one grand and captivating painting and avoid fixating on individual brushstrokes. Now, why do I say that? Because if this book was written to be read in a single setting, which it is, and that in that setting it's not just you listening, but many others, if that's the environment that this text was written for, what would happen if you chose to fixate on a detail? Well, the reader would just keep on going, and you would progressively miss more and more and more of the details of the book that's being read. That fixating on the details isn't an option in public recitals. And so as is true of the original hearers, so it should be true of us as well. One of the biggest mistakes we can make with the rich imagery of Revelation is to fail to see the forest from the trees. Trees are lovely, but the scenic forest is better. And so allow yourself to be carried by the story of the letter and be careful not to fixate too much on the details, because the details were never intended to be fixated upon. However, it is important to note that there is one way in which Revelation's apocalypse differs from many other apocalypses. So it is unique. And that difference is that it doesn't offer a linear review of history. Revelation doesn't offer a timeline of events that either happened in the past or that will happen into the future. In fact, the text itself is written in such a way that it seems to be designed to prevent us from attempting to read it this way. For instance, the end of the world occurs multiple times in the book of Revelation, which would seem to be problematic to me. And depending on who you read, it could end as many as 7 different times throughout this book. And one of which is found in Revelation 6. In verse 13, it describes the stars falling to earth, after which people try to hide from the day of God's wrath. So, if a star collides with earth, what happens? The earth is annihilated. And what is the day of God's wrath? It's the final judgment. So here in chapter 6, just 1/3 of the way through the book of Revelation, the world has already ended. But of course, the earth quickly reappears, all so that it can be annihilated again in chapter 11, where the 24 elders give thanks to God for bringing his wrath and ushering in his final judgment. And we see a similar thing with the grass of the earth. And the grass of the earth is burnt up in chapter 8. But then reappears in chapter 9 as the locusts are commanded not to harm it. And the same is true of Babylon, which is destroyed in chapter 16, only to reappear in chapter 17. And actually we see this in the aforementioned stars as well. The stars that fell to destroy the earth in chapter 6, then reappear in chapter 8 so that a third of them can then be darkened as part of another cycle of threats. All this is to say that the very way in which John has constructed the series of images in Revelation seem designed to prevent us from reading it as a timeline of events, but rather as a spiral, with each cycle consisting of a series of visions that cycle between heaven and earth. The first cycle being the message to the seven churches, followed by the seven seals and then the seven trumpets. Then we have a series of unnumbered visions, followed by the seven plagues, followed again by more unnumbered visions that conclude with the reunification of heaven and earth. And this observation of the non-linear, cyclical nature of Revelation, it's actually not new. It has its origins in the earliest commentary ever written on the book of Revelation. A commentary written by Saint Victorinus, written in the 3rd century. And so what this means is that as I journey through the book of Revelation with you all, I will do so with these assumptions and following these rules of interpretation. I will assume that as it's a letter written to 7 churches in the 1st century, that anything within it would have been understandable by them. As a piece of prophetic literature, I will assume that its primary focus is on present faithfulness. And as an apocalypse, I'll focus on the grand images rather than the small details, and see how they will call us to present faithfulness in light of a future judgment. However, it is a unique apocalypse, right? An apocalypse that doesn't present a linear timeline of events. And so I'll read Revelation as the church has done from as early as the 3rd century, as a series of cyclical images that cycle between heaven and earth. Not only will reading Revelation this way reveal to us its theological messages that are applicable to all times and places, including our own, I also believe that it will help us avoid the embarrassing speculative failures of our all too recent past. Now, for many of you, I understand that what I've just shared may be new. And I understand that new things can be scary. So what I want to do is to simply give you an example of what this process of interpretation looks like in the book of Revelation. And I want to do so using an example of one of those symbols that I've been asked a lot about recently, and that's the mark of the beast. Now, those who adopt a speculative, futuristic approach to interpreting Revelation, well, the mark of the beast has been interpreted as being anything from a barcode to a social security number, to a credit card, to RFID seals, to microchips, to cryptocurrencies, and more recently, to a vaccine. So which is it? Now, the answer is none of them, because all these interpretations fail to take the genre and content of Revelation seriously. None of these could have been understood or reasonably interpreted this way by the audience who received the book of Revelation. And this constant stream of failed predictions, like we see with barcodes and social security numbers and credit cards, well, that should warn us away from this kind of speculation, just as bitter fruit should warn us away from the tree that produced it. See, there's a really simple answer to the question of what the mark of the beast is, and the answer provided by mainstream Christian academia has been steady and consistent in its answer for a very long time. So let's read the passage concerned and then work our way through to an interpretation of it using the rules of letters, prophecy, and apocalyptic. The mark of the beast appears in Revelation chapter 13, verses 16 through 18. And there it says this: "It also forced all people, great and small, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hands or on their forehead, so that they could not buy or sell unless they had the mark. which is the name of the beast or the number of its name. This calls for wisdom. Let the person who has insight calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man, and that number is 666. So, some key points. Firstly, the beast is a man, and the number is his name. The number is 666, and we are called as hearers of the text to calculate that name. Now, ascribing numerical values to names was super common in the first century. It was really common because of a form of folk fortune telling called gematria. In gematria, each letter in your name would be assigned a number based on a preset table from which the numerical value of your name would then be calculated, which would be used to predict your future. Gematria was so common and so widespread that it's even found in graffiti on walls in Pompeii. There, archaeologists discovered a wall inscribed with the message, "I love the woman whose number is 545. And alongside graffiti, we also have the tables that we use to calculate people's numbers, and a reconstructed table is available here. So if you'd like to give it a go, you're more than welcome, but it uses only Greek and Hebrew letters, so you have to translate your name to Greek or Hebrew first to then calculate your number. But you can do it. You can do that. And so what we have here in the Mark of the Beast is a form of first century gematria, with a number that references a man, and that name adds up to 666. Now, the challenge here is that while it's easy to get the number from the name, it's hard to get the name from the number. So is there anything else that might help us narrow down who this person may be? Well, yeah, there is, because there's a second manuscript tradition for the book of Revelation. And in that manuscript tradition, the number of the Mark of the Beast isn't 666, but 616. And that means two things. Firstly, the man to whom the number pointed must have been known to the copyists so they could adjust the number based on how that individual's name is spelt in different contexts and geographies. Secondly, the man's name must have had multiple established spellings, one of which has to add up to 666, another of which has to add up to 616. So is there a man who would have been known to the people of the time, whose name had multiple spellings depending on context, which either added up to 666 or 616? And the answer is yes, there is. And that man is Nero, the man who ruled Rome as Caesar from 54 to 68 AD. The beast referenced in Revelation is a symbolic representation of Nero. But what's the significance of the beast being identified with Nero? Well, the significance here is found in the fact that this isn't the only mark mentioned in the book of Revelation. In fact, it's not even the first, because earlier John describes another mark, which, like this one, is also placed on people's foreheads. Can you think of what that mark might have been? It's the seal of the Spirit, described in Revelation 7, verse 3. And the seal of the Spirit is placed on the foreheads of those who worship the Lamb. So, the mark of the beast isn't the only mark. And what we see in that earlier mark is that it's associated with worship. So here John is using the image of competing marks to remove any grey and paint the world in black and white. Everyone is worshipping something, he's saying, whether you're worshipping Jesus or the ways of the empire, whether you worship the beast or whether you worship the Lamb, everyone is marked by one or the other because everyone is worshiping something. This interpretation of the mark of the beast follows all the rules of letters, prophecies, and apocalyptic. It avoids the errors of futuristic expectations and results in a message that actually speaks meaningfully to us today, just as it would have to the people of the time, shaping our vision and calling us back to faithful worship of Jesus in the here and now. My hope is that this little example helps ease any anxieties that you may feel about this approach to Revelation. But in fact, my hope is that it goes one step further and it begins to whet your appetite for some of the fascinating insights this book has to offer that we are going to explore together. So God bless, and I'll see you at church on Sunday.